More than 20 months of war and a pause of war branded as ceasefire deal, the death toll of the people in Palestine are still rising every day. According to recent reports from many sources, more than 62,000 people, including many children, have been killed in Israeli attacks on Gaza since October 2023. On the other hand, around 1,100 people died in Israel. As the Israel-Hamas war continues, there's been a lot of discussion around Zionism. Since October 7, the term Zionism has been everywhere in the news. It's been used to support Israel in what it calls its war against Hamas, a refrain to remind everyone why Israel exists and why it must be protected. Others have used Zionism to describe what they view as Israel's collective punishment of civilians in Gaza and its appropriation of Palestinian territories, what they often call settler colonialism. So today, we are going to find out about Zionism, its history, how it began and why, and what is the impacts of Zionism on this current war in Gaza. Put simply, Zionism is a nationalist movement that advocates for a homeland for the Jewish people in the biblical land of Israel. Zionism is an ethnocultural nationalist movement that emerged in Europe in the late 19th century that aimed to establish and maintain a national home for the Jewish people, pursued through the colonization of Palestine, a region roughly corresponding to the land of Israel in Judaism, with central importance in Jewish history. Zionists wanted to create a Jewish state in Palestine with as much land, as many Jews, and as few Palestinian Arabs as possible. The World Zionist Organization, established by Theodor Herzl in 1897, declared that the aim of Zionism was to establish a national home for the Jewish people secured by public law. The State of Israel as we know it today is a product of Zionism. Zionism is a political philosophy of Jewish nationalism. It combines partly religious and partly historical ideas that claim the world's Jewish population has a right to that part of the modern Middle East that has, for thousands of years, been home to Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, Christians and Jews. One of the first milestones was the establishment of the Hovevei Zion movement in 1881, which united various Zionist organizations under one umbrella. A year later came the First Aliyah, followed immediately by the Second Aliyah, the first waves of mass Jewish immigration to the land of Palestine. In these two waves, which lasted from 1882 to 1914, about 65,000 Jews immigrated to the land of Palestine. They established the basis for the new, urban and rural Hebrew settlement. In 1897, in the middle of the First Aliyah, and against the background of the multiplicity of Zionist streams, a political turn was given to Zionism by Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist who convened the First Zionist Congress at Basel, Switzerland, which drew up the Basel program of the movement, stating that Zionism strives to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. He also held the First Zionist Congress. The Congress, which convened every year or every 2 years, passed resolutions that outlined the Zionist movement's path of action. The center of the movement was established in Vienna, where Herzl published the official weekly Die Welt, The World. When the Ottoman government refused Herzl's request for Jewish autonomy in Palestine, he found support in Great Britain. In 1903, the British government offered 6,000 square miles of land in Uganda for settlement, but the Zionists held out for Palestine. At the death of Herzl in 1904, the leadership moved from Vienna to Cologne and then to Berlin. Prior to World War I, Zionism represented only a minority of Jews, mostly from Russia but led by Austrians and Germans. It developed propaganda through orators and pamphlets, created its own newspapers, and gave an impetus to what was called a Jewish Renaissance in letters and arts. The development of the modern Hebrew language largely took place during that period. By 1914, there were about 90,000 Jews in Palestine. 13,000 settlers lived in 43 Jewish agricultural settlements. Upon the outbreak of World War I, political Zionism reasserted itself, and its leadership passed to Russian Jews living in England. Two such Zionists, Chaim Weizmann and Nahum Sokolow, were instrumental in obtaining the Balfour Declaration from Great Britain, November 2, 1917, which promised British support for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. The declaration was included in Britain's League of Nations mandate over Palestine, 1922. Meanwhile, Zeev Vladimir Jabotinsky, whose revisionist strand of Zionism, which later constituted much of the Israeli right, emphasized the need to secure self-determination through armed force, began organizing a Jewish self-defense movement in Palestine. The Haganah, a Zionist military organization that was later transformed into the core of the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, was established in 1920. In March 1925, the Jewish population in Palestine was officially estimated at 108,000, and it rose to about 238,000, 20% of the population, by 1933. Jewish immigration remained relatively slow, however, until the rise of Adolf Hitler in Europe. Nevertheless, the Arab population feared that Palestine would eventually become a Jewish state and bitterly resisted Zionism and the British policy supporting it. British forces struggled to maintain order in the face of a series of Arab uprisings. The strain of suppressing the Arab Revolt of 1936–39, which was more extensive and sustained than earlier uprisings, ultimately led Britain to reassess its policies. In hopes of keeping the peace between Jews and Palestinian Arabs and retaining Arab support against Germany and Italy in World War II, Britain placed restrictions on Jewish immigration in 1939. The new restrictions were violently opposed by underground revisionist groups such as the Stern Gang and Irgun Zavai Leumi, which committed acts of terrorism and assassination against the British and organized illegal Jewish immigration to Palestine. In the wake of Hitler's rise to power and British restrictions on immigration, the strategy of illegal immigration was advanced, and lasted from 1934 until the establishment of the state. This took place alongside various political efforts during the same period on the part of the Zionist movement. Despite great risk and violent confrontations with the British, approximately 120,000 Jews were clandestinely brought to Israel. Within a few years of the establishment of the state, hundreds of thousands of Jews immigrated to Israel. The Holocaust, the large-scale extermination of European Jews by the Nazis, led many Jews to seek refuge in Palestine and many others, especially in the United States, to embrace Zionism. As tensions grew among Arabs and Zionists, Britain submitted the Palestine problem first to Anglo-US discussion for a solution and later to the United Nations, UN, which on November 29, 1947, proposed partition of the country into separate Arab and Jewish states and the internationalization of Jerusalem. The creation of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, triggered tension among the neighboring Arab countries, and those who lost their lands in the process revolted and was soundly defeated by the Israeli army. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel held more land than had been allotted to it under the UN partition plan. About 800,000 Arabs had also fled or been expelled from the area that became Israel, an event remembered today as the Nakba, while Israel had to grapple with absorbing 850,000 Jews from the Middle East who fled or had been expelled from their countries. Zionism after Israel's establishment was also forced to grapple with the question of balancing Jewish self-determination with democracy, particularly as concerns arose over the ability of Israel to maintain a demographic Jewish majority. Israel at its founding had a sizable Arab minority with a high birth rate. But it quickly saw a tremendous influx of immigrants as Jews arrived in large numbers from Arab countries and as Zionists promoted an ingathering of the exiles, in which Jews around the world were encouraged to immigrate. After the Six-Day War, 1967, Israel's occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and other predominantly Arab territories placed more than 1 million additional Arabs under Israel's de facto rule. Israeli sovereignty, and offer of citizenship, was applied to residents of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and not the other territories, but uncertainty over the long-term status of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip prompted concerns that Israel would eventually have to choose between losing its Jewish majority or denying democratic rights to the Palestinian Arabs under its military occupation. For many labor Zionists, a two-state solution was the ideal way to ensure Israel could be a democratic state with a Jewish majority. But for many revisionist Zionists, the proximity and terrain of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip presented an existential security risk for the already tiny state of Israel. A small minority of Zionists called for Israel to assert full control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, since those territories include towns, regions, and holy sites that they considered integral to the history of the Jewish people. Thus, 50 years after the First Zionist Congress and 30 years after the Balfour Declaration, Zionism achieved its aim of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, but at the same time, it became an armed camp for Palestine and its people. Zionism, a European colonial movement for Greater Israel, which is the reason for today's occupation in most of the Palestine including Gaza and West Bank, resulting a partied nation, the biggest open-air prison of the world, under the one of the most powerful military forces. It syncretized Jewish longing for safety and self-defense with white supremacist, messianic and fascistic ideologies. This synthesis birthed a new, nationalist Jewish identity that equates Jewish safety with the construction of an exclusivist homeland in Palestine through the displacement of the region's indigenous populations. Settler colonial endeavors typically depend on depicting the targeted territory as uninhabited and its existing inhabitants as inhuman barbarians unworthy of any land. This portrayal allowed Zionists to displace the indigenous population of Palestine without moral qualms, portraying the establishment of Israel not as the destruction of a people but as the construction of a villa in the jungle. Within the Israeli society grounded in land and resource theft, offensive aggression under the guise of self-defense has been rewarded and reinforced from the very beginning and consequently became a routine part of life. By reinstating fear and hijacking trauma associated with past and present negative experiences of Jewish people, Zionist leaders ensured the settler population's continued support for aggressive, expansionist, hegemonic, genocidal policies and shielded their corruption and other criminal endeavors from public scrutiny. To maintain Israel's violently oppressive status quo and expand the territory of the settler colony, Zionists opportunistically conflated their colonial ideology with Judaism. Beyond justifying violent land theft, the conflation of Zionism and Judaism serves to delegitimize indigenous resistance by equating any criticism of Zionism or Israel's policies towards the Palestinians as an attack on Jews. Further, it hinders anti-colonial resistance by portraying a political struggle over land and resources between occupying settlers backed by imperial forces and an indigenous occupied people as a supposed ancient religious conflict between equals. On October 7, the carefully constructed Zionist facade of incremental genocide within a liberal, democratic framework collapsed, exposing Israel's genocidal and fascistic core. Zionists in Israel and beyond did not mourn the end of this charade, and instead celebrated their newfound freedom to kill and destroy Palestinians without any restraint or pretense. This development not only poses a threat of elimination to the Palestinian people but since the occupied territories are used as a laboratory for the development and testing of new military technology and strategies.